Good morning, everyone. My name's Steve Baggs. I'm one of the programme leads at the Greater South East Net Zero Hub, and it's beautifully sunny here, so I hope it's sunny where you are. But we're hoping to have quite an interesting debate today on this webinar on waste heat resources. Just going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. Like I say, please introduce yourself into the chat. Please stay muted during the presentations, and if you've got a question, please add it into the chat. We're hoping to take questions at the end. We're going to have a significant amount of time, probably around about 20 minutes for questions at the end. And just to say, the event's going to be recorded, and we will email out the recording and the slides sometime next week. We'll also have some information probably in the middle of next week where you can download the waste heat map so that you can see it yourselves and start using it. Great. Okay. I'm just going to move on to the agenda today. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm delighted to say we've got Seamus from Ricardo, who's going to talk about the overview of the waste heat mapping study, and then give a demonstration on how the tool works. And then we'll have a significant amount of time for some more questions, a bit of debate, ask about the tool, and hopefully we'll be able to answer your hopefully not too difficult questions. So yeah, let me start. So why did the hub look at waste heat? And what are the reasons behind that? Well, I mean, principally, number one, we know that heating makes up quite a large amount of the built environment in terms of emissions. And we had a bit of a real kind of lack of understanding of what the potential might be for waste heat or recovering waste heat across the region. So that was one of the kind of main motivators to do this piece of work. We also were doing a lot more work around heat networks, and we saw the potential there for using waste heat in heat networks. And of course, we were very aware of the new zoning legislation that's likely to come in fairly soon. The latest I hear is June 2025, so it'd be interesting to hear more on that. Yeah, we've also done a piece of work around industrial clusters, and so we saw also the potential for recovering waste heat for industrial sites. We know there's been some really good examples already, namely Kemsley down in Sittingbourne, where a group of companies already recover their heat for a number of sources and reuse in a number of their buildings there. So we saw that this a real good opportunity to understand that going forwards. And then lastly, hopefully this tool will be useful to inform certain parts of your local energy plans, local growth plans, and also from our point of view, the work that's going on around regional energy plans as well. So what we've done, we've appointed Ricardo, which was a good move, and they had some history of doing some of this stuff before with the Southwest Hub, and delighted that they came on board and have been supporting this. What we really wanted to do is something which was dynamic in terms of a map of waste heat sources. So we wanted it to be able to be updated for you to be able to use it with other sources. So it's hopefully going to be able to kind of inform those local air energy plans and work with kind of DNO plans as well. It's always a difficult one, this, but we wanted to have enough information to be able to make decisions, but not to make it too complicated so it was unwieldy and difficult to use. So hopefully we've come to a compromise on that going forward. And of course, we really kind of identified that this is kind of not just for heat networks and industrial areas, but includes potentially businesses, public sector, communities, and the kind of interactions between all of those and how this tool might be used to kind of inform projects. At the end of the day, we're about trying to increase the investment pipeline to actually make projects happen and get them delivered. And I think that's key for us, is we want this tool to be used to make things happen. And that's what we're all about at the Hub. Okay, I think I've kind of laid out the introduction. I'd like to now hand over to Seamus at Ricardo, and he's going to give us further detail about the tool and some of the background. Seamus, over to you. I'll stop sharing and allow you to share.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, just introduce myself first of all. Seamus Rooney. I'm a principal consultant here at Ricardo, specialising in heat decarbonisation. And I'm going to walk through a bit of background, as Steve says, first of all, and then we'll get into demonstrating the tool, what it is, what it does, and how you can use it. Just going to try to present that. It's always a bit more here. So I'm conscious we've got a number of people on the line with different bits of experience. So some of this might be familiar to people already. But I think it was useful to get a bit of a background in terms of what's going on with heat networks and some of the policy aspects. So the first bit is just in terms of heat network policy, because clearly for waste heat, one of the potential uses for it is around heat networks. The main thing here is there's a lot of active policy development. There's a lot of pieces to this, and they're all at one or another stage of development. There's the Energy Act itself. Fundamental principle here is that heat networks are going to be a regulated utility, with Ofgem being a regulator. So that's not the status they've got or have had in the past. And then there's some detail around how that's going to work. I'm not going to go into too much today, but the principle then is things like consumer protection. What does fair pricing look like? There's consultation Ofgem have got out at the moment. So there's quite a lot of that kind of development going on in terms of regulating heat networks. Then from a zoning perspective, as Steve mentioned, clearly DESNZ have been working on this for some time, and the UK government are still working on working towards announcements in terms of their policy on zoning. The principle behind zoning is to identify areas where heat networks have the potential to be the lowest cost solution for decarbonising heat. So that's what DESNZ have designated, and it's a useful principle there, because that then leads us on to why would waste heat be useful to identify and what role could potentially play. It's worth me mentioning also that they're going to do that area by area. That's not all going to land as one set of network zones across England. I know some of you in the call might be involved in developing some of those zones and doing some of those studies. But for those who are not so familiar with it, that will be getting done area by area. There's some advanced zoning studies have been undergone already, and then there's more to follow, depending on what DESNZ final decisions that DESNZ make. And the waste heat is a useful part of doing that. We'll come back to that point in a moment. The other thing I just wanted to mention was in terms of technical assurance of networks, there is separately a technical assurance scheme, heat network technical assurance scheme, which is developing what does technical assurance look like for heat networks. And that will set out some of the detail of partly the interaction with the rules that will then be relied upon for some of those regulatory aspects, as well as providing updated guidance on designing heat networks. So the key point there is this piece of work is clearly one of the motivations is around heat networks, and heat network zoning is one aspect of that, but this is very much under active development. So exactly what heat networks look like in an area, what heat network policy is, that's all many moving parts to that at the moment, and that will continue to be the case for some years. But it's clear strategically the UK government see it as having a role in decarbonising heat and it being of strategic importance. So that gets on to why waste heat? Why is it important? So in the context of heat networks, first of all, there's really a couple of things it can have an effect with, which is it's ultimately about helping the heat network deliver on those aims. So we mentioned cost of heat provided. Network's got to be able to provide heat at a reasonable cost and still have a business model, still operate effectively, regardless of what the operating model is. It's got to be effective in those terms. There's two components to that. The one is the cost of building the network in the first place, this is a capital intensive, especially larger networks in urban areas are capital intensive, but ultimately by that least cost pathway, it's that pooling those capital costs together ends up being worthwhile. Recovering waste heat can be a way of reducing some of those capital costs, but it's particularly important in reducing the operating cost. Low cost heat into a network means it's much more likely that they can provide heat at a reasonable price, and therefore helps that business case. So that's part of that context. Then leading on to that, I suppose there's the potential then for zoning an area to become a zone, or where heat networks could be most cost effective if the balance is tipped by the presence of waste heat, because that then makes something which might be slightly marginal, the abundance of low-cost waste heat at a suitable grade in an area might be a significant contributing factor to its potential. That would then be clearly a key stakeholder group to take forward and something to explore from a technical perspective. But I just want to make clear that this isn't ultimately about, this is about waste heat rather than about heat networks overall. The counterfactual, the alternative technology, there's a number of different things, but if waste heat's not available at the moment, most low carbon networks are moving towards heat pumps of one type or another. So just in that context, there will be some networks which make sense where waste heat's not available, and they will mostly be using where low carbon heat from heat pumps. In terms of the new networks going forward, I know historically CHP and a number of other things as well, but just in that context, it's not waste heat or nothing, but it is definitely important. Finally, Steve mentioned industrial clusters, and that's an important aspect of this in terms of where waste heat might be both available and then used. And on that business to business sort of industrial cluster aspect, that will be different from urban heat networks in a number of different ways. The grades of heat may be different, the nature of the relationships and business model could be slightly different, but the principle there that if one site has waste heat available, that could be useful to another site to avoid them having to burn fossil fuels to generate heat and meet their demand. So hopefully the tool's useful in identifying those, as well as doing that kind of strategic heat network zoning piece. Very finally, I want to touch on grades of heat, because this is clearly one of the things that determines how useful some waste heat is that what temperatures are available at. And I want to set a little bit of context here, which is that there will be some sites like industrial sites, hospitals, those kind of places which need very high temperatures, often steam or some other heat medium, and those sites may have waste heat available themselves, but while that's not usually where most of the larger heat networks are operating at those higher temperatures. It's a temperature somewhat below that, but there will be some of those sites, and that might be in that sort of industrial cluster group. Most buildings, the convention was in the UK for heating systems to be designed at 8271. This is not to say every building will be operating at that or designed at that. That's not the case. But as a reference point for some of the numbers we're going to talk about, that those temperatures that the existing heating system operates at would then need to be met, or either met by the heat network and therefore waste heat going into the network, or alternatively would need to be some changes made to the building in one shape or form. So that's the first thing, is if it can meet those demands, it's of most use. There's then, sorry, there's noise in the background. There's then a sort of the potential for energy efficiency measures for newer buildings that have been designed with heating systems operating at lower temperatures, and there's a push to reduce network temperatures. That one of the reasons for that is to integrate waste heat, and so hopefully more things are then useful in that context. The minimum temperature we can get is often governed by hot water, where the network has to provide hot water from it, because we've got Legionella rules in the UK which limit the temperature. So whereas there is a push to try and get that temperature down as much as possible, and down to 50 degrees in some cases, within what are referred to as fourth generation networks, we don't often see them in the UK for networks which incorporate domestic properties or properties where hot water's got to be provided from the network, because the Legionella rules limit the minimum temperature that water can be stored at and distributed at. So there are still some of those networks where that limitation doesn't apply, or hot water is provided through some alternative means. So I don't want to say that's never possible it can be, but it's worth just being aware that the drive for lower temperatures is useful, but there's some limits on that. Fifth generation heat networks are worth mentioning because we'll go on to low temperature heat sources when I show the map in a moment. Lower temperature heat sources waste heat can be recovered through networks which then distribute heat at those lower temperatures and upgrade it within each building. That's often referred to as a fifth generation heat network. The temperature within those networks is often around ambient temperature. One of the principles is that the pipes then don't need insulated. So, but heat can be upgraded by heat pumps regardless of within a wide variety of different ranges, but that particular model is often referred to as fifth generation heat networks. Some of the heat sources we're talking, we'll come on to in a moment, that we'll be mapping, might be more useful in the context of those kind of networks than they would be for larger strategic networks. Clearly, lower temperature heat could be upgraded to a higher temperature using a heat pump centrally, and that might come from a data center, for example, and there are networks that do that because they operate more effectively than if they were taking the heat from the air, because they get a higher temperature. So waste heat still useful there. So that quick rattle through background as to some of why we're doing this and some of the limitations that may apply. I'm going to try and share the tool itself now. Can you see that, Steve?
Yep, can see that.
Perfect. So first thing to say is this, as Steve said, we want it to be as useful as possible to as many people. So the idea is that this is all opened in Google Maps, or can be opened in Google Maps. We know that GIS is often used, but not everybody will have this available. And so Google Maps is a free available piece of software that many organizations either have or can freely get hold of, and is used by a wider range of people. There's also other things in terms of getting that initial context. Hopefully some of the mapping can be useful to understand the sort of local context around some of what's possible. The principle is we've put the data available in layers. So clearly there's a lot of information here. And so in order to make it useful, we want to be able to select, rather than apply everything at once, we want to be able to select specific aspects that may be of relevance. So I'll get on to the actual source of heat in a moment. We know that many of these studies are geographical, so we've got the geographic areas set out here. Not going to get into the naming of different boundary types and county-council boundaries, etc. But we've set out some that hopefully allow you to focus in on a specific area. So if you are doing study in Brighton and Hove, for example, or studying Cambridgeshire, you can select those areas, and that will hopefully help in terms of interpreting what else is there. Another boundary we've got in terms of that kind of context is the urban areas and major conurbations, so that, again, looking at where waste heat sources are available, is it likely to be close to something where there's some demand? I know that when we're doing local area energy plans or heat network zoning studies, whatever, there will be a number of things taken into account, but at that initial screening of trying to understand which of these things am I likely to care about in the course of the study, that it's some ways of interpreting that. And there's some other source of information in terms of existing operational heat networks, those kind of things. We've then got the heat sources split up by both grade, and that's what I was talking about in terms of temperatures, and by size, how much waste heat is likely to be available. To preface this by saying this is based on the best available information, but clearly it uses national data sets. Clearly, these national data sets, the world is constantly changing, and also the information is as accurate as it can, as possible, but some later verification is definitely needed to understand exactly what temperature and what capacity of heat is available, and then the relevance of how you go about achieving that, those kind of later steps. The principle here is we've got large, which is over 83 gigawatts. The principle there is large network, sort of strategically important sources of heat, if I could put it like that. And so that's ideally so that might be a relevance to whether an area is potentially suitable for a zone. It can contribute, as I say, in a strategic way. So that around 83 gigawatt hours. Medium then is somewhere between 7 and 83 gigawatt hours, and small is under 7. So it's still a reasonable. What we're saying small, this isn't one house or anything. It's potentially important to heat networks, but it's less likely to have an effect on a large scale urban network, for example, than some of the larger sources. The second thing we split them up by then is the grade of heat. And so I mentioned this before, and I wanted to give that context previously because this is one of the things that we thought was useful at that initial point. As Steve was saying, we want this to be as useful as possible to people, but also simple. And so splitting this up, we have different symbols for high, medium, and low temperature, with the red triangles being the high temperature heat sources, the orange diamonds being medium, and then blue circles being low grade. The size of the symbols is then how the amount of heat that's available, and you see that there's quite a lot of smaller, particularly lower temperature heat sources, for example. So that means that you can it might be that you care about everything for the purposes of study, but it might be that you've got something specific in mind that allows you to filter in that way. Then if we look at the purpose, then is to allow you to identify heat sources which are potentially of interest. So if you were looking at Cambridge, for example, you can see there are a number of heat sources here. Some of them are within Cambridge, some of them are just outside, and it might, and for high temperature heat sources, it might actually be cost effective to pipe heat in from outside. For example, when we look at this, you can click on it and get some information. It's an incinerator producing high temperature heat. So that hopefully then allows you to engage with those organizations and identify them as a potential stakeholder, understand what whether they could have a role to play. So that there's quite a lot of information in here, but hopefully splitting it out in that way means that it's not quite so overwhelming. As I say, if we've got everything on, it's quite a lot to try and interpret. So it is to make it as useful as possible. So that example I've got there is perhaps when you're doing an urban heat network zoning, you might have the heat sources themselves, and then some of these other heat networks which are either have been built or have been planned. That hopefully then gives you some further information in terms of those networks themselves. And then finally, Steve mentioned industrial clusters are a potentially important aspect to this. So there's a number of waste heat sources potentially available in some areas where that is within an industrial cluster. So looking at Sittingbourne and Kemsley, there's quite a number of industrial sites which have heat available. The heat's available at different grades, and therefore there is the potential for those businesses to work together to recover heat from one to another at a business to business level. It may also be possible to do other heat networks, but that piece separate from district heating, more about industrial clusters. Hopefully it's useful in that context as well. So it's back to that point, the intention is to allow you to identify both where heat's available, have an initial screening of how useful it may be to you, and then give you the opportunity to engage with that organisation as a stakeholder with whatever study you're looking to do, whether that is around zoning itself, local area energy planning, whatever it would be. Steve, I've gone through that at a bit of pace, but I think just on that final point there in terms of engaging with stakeholders, I think you were saying that the hub themselves might have a role to play there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just quickly share a slide in terms of the support that we can give sort of around this particular area, which I think is relevant. Hopefully that comes up. But yeah, I mean, thank you very much, Seamus. That was really interesting to give us a bit of an overview of the tool there and give us a bit of an understanding. Let me just go through. Bear with me. There we go. Can everyone see that? Hopefully that's okay to see. Yeah, and I thought I'd just give you some idea of how the hub can help in terms of supporting sort of waste heat related projects. Seamus has talked a lot about their heat network zoning, and we now have an engagement officer. I think Emma Jane might even be on the call. So, but Emma Jane Danielson is our new, not actually not that new anymore, Emma Jane, but Jane's available to help and support around heat network zoning engagement. So that's a really useful tool that the hub have in terms of working on that potential new legislation that's coming out. I want to also mention the industrial clusters tools that we've got. So we've got some work that we've done previously, and we can put in some detail as well about the new tools that we've got, which is for a local authority to use or for a business to use to understand how they could use maybe some of that waste heat, or look at sort of measures that they might be able to put in place to reduce carbon on site. We've also got quite a bit of information on heat network sort of development, so we can signpost information and help. We've also got people here who are working around local area energy plans and regional energy plans, and how that fits in with what Seamus has been talking about in terms of waste heat mapping and recoverable waste heat to inform some of those plans and maybe help some of those plans. The waste heat mapping tool itself, which we're talking about, and then a number of other tools that we've got which might help to identify, for example, who is in those premises that has been producing the waste heat, or what's the landowner kind of relationship in certain areas. So we've got some tools which identify that, which make it again be very useful in this regard. And finally, just a mention for Net Zero Go, where there's further tools and information about waste heat, and we will have this within those tools as well. So it's just a bit of a heads up, really, to say we're here to help. Hopefully the waste heat tool will be really useful for you going forward, and there's a suite of other tools there and information that can also help. Right, so we've actually we're time wise we've got 30 minutes now for any questions, so let's put it out there, and put your hand up if you've got questions, and we'll go through some of the chat as well. But if anyone's got any burning questions right now, please put your hand up and we'll go through the questions in the chat as well.
So I see that in the chat Anita's got a question in terms of what data sets we used. That's a good point. Combination of data sets. So DESNES have there's some DESNES data on waste heat sources which underpin this. First of all, we've also then used the National Emissions Inventory. Those and they're the two primary data sets which underpin this. There's then some interpretation of particular which sector the sites are within. So the National Emissions Inventory data includes pollutants, so it's useful to identify sites who maybe got significant amount of combustion on site, for example, and therefore may have waste heat. That can help us understand which sector they're in, but not necessarily the amount of heat or the grade of heat within that information. So that we've done some interpretation based on the sites, the magnitude of, or the sort of nature of the emissions from the emissions inventory data, and then what that looks like in terms of an estimated heat demand and what grade of heat is likely to be available. So there's a bit, I think, within that. Sometimes with the waste heat data is available, say from DESNES on specific sites, and that's in more detail. for some of those other sites, that it comes from emissions inventory data. So they're the two primary data sets that underpin this. And because there's differences within those data sets, there's a slightly different process that we've been through to arrive at the key information. Hopefully that's useful.
I'm just looking at the chat. There's another question from Sam about sort of experience with HNDU dismissing a green heat network funding application linked to Thames water pumping stations due to the potential collapse of Thames water. How do you think this can be overcome?
Well, it's a good question. I suppose that gets onto a point about a commercial relationship, because clearly you can have something which is technically possible, but you can't necessarily arrive at a commercial agreement between them. So it's a good question. It's not something that I'm going to be in a position to answer today, but I think that is definitely a challenge for an organisation the size of Thames Water, given both the capacity, the number of sites they've got, the capacity of heat that might be available, and the relevance. So it's clearly an important question. But Steve, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to answer that one today. That seems like one to possibly take back.
Okay, we'll come back to you on that one, Sam. That sounds like quite a complex answer to that question. Maggie, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I put a question in the chat just on how the tool will be kept up to date on any new growth or new developments or new industry or industrial areas that has a new heat source. And I guess that also links in a little bit, if you don't mind me saying, Stella, who's just put one in the chat as well, is that if there is a connection to a heat network, does it still remain on the map? So it's just, how do you keep that map and that tool alive?
Yeah, I guess from our point of view, we're hoping to regularly update the tool. The fact that it's GIS, that we can do that. So, I don't know quite how often at the moment, but at least I'm thinking every year that we update this tool with any new information that we get and can find out, to keep it alive and dynamic. That's my ambition anyway. Seamus, I don't know what others might do. I think the Southwest Hub are doing something similar, so they're trying to keep it updated as much as possible going forward.
Yeah, and I think we're going to be that point of the connection. I think we're going through a period at the moment where, as I say, there's quite a lot of active policy development. If decisions on zoning are made, we'll see quite a lot of that happen. These are developing heat networks. Takes quite a bit of time, and particularly for the ones where there's some zoning in place. So I think it's an important question about updating it. I think at the same time, there's some of these developments in terms of has something been connected. I think that's not likely to be a really rapidly changing picture in terms of those connections, but clearly what happens to sites? Do they continue to exist, or do they what happens with them? There can be that turnover. So again, it's probably one to keep in touch with Steve about, and that's always a challenge with these with any national data set, is that the data sets themselves do get updated periodically, and there's different data sets have got different frequencies of being updated as well.
I'm just reading Dan's got a good question. Hi Dan, hope you're well. Around stakeholder engagement, and all well and good having a waste heat source, but you need those people to kind of be engaged and be part of the program, and if they don't, then that makes it quite difficult. Agreed. But I think also on the flip side, we're hearing quite a lot of, for example, I know of in my own area in Maidstone where there's really good potential for waste heats to be used from one of the waste to energy plants. And I'm hearing that across some other areas. I know certainly in Kemsley and Sittingbourne in Kent as well, where they're using waste heat within a kind of industrial cluster. So I think absolutely there's opportunities, but it relies on relationships and people and engagement. And so that's very valid, I think, Dan, in what you're saying. Seamus, any views from you?
I think the other thing I would say is that from a local authority perspective, it's also worth engaging within the local authority to understand what relationships are in place already, because what I've found dealing with local authorities is that energy from waste plants, for example, waste incineration, there will be some elements of a local authority, and I've realised that in different areas the relationships might be held at county council level rather than, that there could be differences in who owns those relationships. But understanding, is there, if you've got an organisation that you're looking to get in contact with, is there someone within the council that's already got a relationship with them? Because that can be really useful. And from a mentioning energy from waste plants, because clearly they are both relatively high temperatures and significant amounts of heat available, so they are important sources of heat. That the local authority often has a role to play in having a commercial relationship with them, and contracts in place. So there would naturally be some points where contracts are up for renegotiation, where this could be one aspect of that. There will be some organisations who are more keen to engage than others, and that's the nature of it. There are potential there's some proposals around potentially, or there's been discussion around potentially obliging some sites to make heat available. I think at this point in time, I'd be going into this about more of a trying to build a relationship with them and trying to find something that's in mutual interest. In my experience, it's very difficult to force anyone to do that and come up with especially when you're starting from a standing start and there's not so many examples of it. It's not a well-developed market in that way yet. So I think it's about really building relationships, and the first step is often about understanding, is there someone within your organisation that's already got a relationship with them? And from a council perspective, when you're doing zoning, that there's often someone, I know that can be difficult to identify who they are and engage internally. Sometimes it's easier to engage with external stakeholders, but building on those relationships can be really important.
Thanks, Seamus. So there's a question here from Eleanor. So it's around planning information. It's highlighting that one of the incinerator that we highlighted at Waterbeach had the application declined, but I'm assuming probably, Seamus, we've got planning information on there from various different databases. So actually, we'll make sure
we'll have a look at it.
We'll have a look at that one. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll have a look at it. I think it may be that there's some potential sites within the designated waste heat data. We can have a look at that, Steve. But thank you for highlighting it, Eleanor. That's useful.
Thank you.
Because that's also, in terms of it being as useful as possible, you want to try and identify things which are potentially going to be in place. But yeah, we'll take that away and have a look.
Yeah, and this is the importance of these kinds of things, because local knowledge is really important. People who are right down at the kind of granular level of this, so we can hopefully inform the waste tool from all the relationships and the communications that we get from working with local authorities and public sector organisations. So yeah, that's really good. Stephen's in Australia. Wow, we're reaching Australia. Okay. Thanks, Stephen. That's okay. So looking to bring heat and industrial precincts line to industrial symbiosis. Yeah. Okay. So I think, I know some of the areas that we've been working with in terms of the industrial work. We've been looking at this whole idea of industrial symbiosis, which I think is really fascinating subject. Yeah, I guess it has to be a multi-sector kind of collaboration in some of these things, So I know some of the work that's gone down in Kemsley is through local authorities, communities, businesses, universities. It's a collaboration between, multi-sector organisations, and I think that's where it works really well. Seamus, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I think that there has been the industrial clusters, I think, have been used from a number of perspectives. Some of that's around energy infrastructure, some of that's around recovering waste heat. So I think that's probably been the mechanism in the UK. There's also within that a push for sites to recover heat themselves, and I think we've seen more of a a lot of sites are looking to recover heat within their own boundary, and that's where that engagement's important, because there might be heat available that's available now, but they've got a plan for when they next do an upgrade to their production facility or something that's in the pipeline for a few years' time. They might have an opportunity to recover heat within their own site rather than make it available. So that's where engaging with them can be quite important, and ultimately that's driven by the same drivers in terms of decarbonisation that you mentioned. So I think it's slightly different in the UK, but I think that industrial cluster approach is probably the main driver there for industrial users. For taking heat from industry then to urban areas, the zoning is really the intention of the route towards that, identifying heat network zones, those areas where heat networks could be the lowest cost way of decarbonising heat, and then identifying what waste heat could feed into that zone.
Thank you. Stella, yeah, very good points. Stella always pulls me up on things, so yeah, absolutely agreed. Let's find a way that we can communicate any upgrades that need to be done fairly quickly. So I'm sure we can do that probably through my team, and pass that through to Seamus to kind of upgrade. So yeah, we'll take that on board.
I want to come back to Dan's point in terms of that stakeholder engagement as well. I think that my experience is there's a lot more organisations are interested in this and are keen to engage in one of a number of ways, and particularly large industrial sites. Clearly, there's a number of different pressures, but corporate reporting is really having an effect in terms of the desire of those much larger businesses to decarbonise. And that can take a number of forms. And one opportunity for them is to provide waste heat, and there can be benefits to them in doing that. So I think it is very difficult sometimes, and it's sometimes difficult to get in contact with those. But it just my experience is that has got easier with quite a number of organisations over the last few years. What can be difficult is understanding who's the best person to speak to within an organisation and who's got responsibility for it. But yeah. It goes back to that point about trying to leverage any existing relationships and using the support from the hub, I think, as well, because there might be some existing relationships there.
Right. We've got another question from Tanith around, is this the same as the Southwest tool, which has been live for a year or so? Pretty much, yes, although there's some slight differences, I think, Seamus. So yeah, Seamus and his team worked on the Southwest tool previously as well.
Yeah, the principle is the same. In practice, the way that there's some differences, as you mentioned, in terms of how we represented the data, but the principle behind it is the same in terms of being able to identify things. There's some differences between the Southeast and the Southwest, clearly, in terms of what's there, but also, engaging within organisations, trying to understand and build from the experience of having done that with the Southwest to try and make something which is as relevant as it can be for the Southeast. So, the principle is the same, but they're not exactly the same for a number of reasons.
Thank you. Right. Any more questions? Please put your hands up or put something into the chat. I'll give it another couple of minutes. Any other thoughts or? If not, we'll do a bit of a wrap up. Just to say that we will put the tool onto our website, and we'll have a little bit of an instructions on there as well, and we'll put the webinar as well onto the website so everyone can access that. I think it's more likely to be towards the end of next week now, but yeah, we'll try and put that on, and feel free to contact us if you want more information about the tool and how we intend to use it. Any more questions? Can't see anything else. But thank you, everyone. Hopefully that was useful to everyone. Gave you some of the context, went through the tool, And please remember, the hub is here to support and help. We are free and impartial. Not many people can say that, but please use us. And look forward to finding out more about your plans. Right, I think we'll end it there. Thank you, Seamus, very much for taking us through all of that. And thank you to everyone for
Thanks,
coming
Steve.
along. Look at that, we're finished. You've got 13 minutes back of your life, you lucky people. Lovely to see you, and have a great weekend, everyone. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.